Hey friends, tonight we are stepping back roughly 20,000 years into a world so cold, so vast, and so strangely beautiful that your modern brain would honestly struggle to process it. There are no cities on the horizon, no roads, no coffee shops, just an endless sweep of frozen grass, pale sky, and somewhere out there in the distance, a slow, dark shape moving through the wind. And that shape, enormous, shaggy, unhurried, is exactly why we are here tonight. Because tonight, we are talking about mammoths. Not just what they looked like or where they lived, but why they genuinely ruled this frozen world in a way that almost nothing else could. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like saying hello, drop a comment with where you are in the world and what time it is. There is something quietly wonderful about knowing people are drifting off to prehistoric history from 100 different cities at once. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The world you are entering tonight is called the Pleistocene Epoch, and it lasted from roughly 2.6 million years ago, all the way to about 11,700 years ago. That is an enormous stretch of time, so long that modern humans, with all their cleverness and adaptability, only showed up near the very end of it. For most of the Pleistocene, Earth was doing something it does periodically, something slow and relentless, and completely indifferent to anything living on its surface. It was cycling through ice ages. Now, when people hear the phrase ice age, they tend to picture the entire Earth buried under a solid sheet of white. That is not quite right. The ice ages of the Pleistocene were more like long cold pulses, interrupted by slightly warmer stretches called interglacials. During the coldest peaks, enormous ice sheets, some of them nearly 3 kilometers thick, covered large portions of North America, Europe, and Asia. Sea levels dropped dramatically because so much of the planet's water was locked up in glaciers. Coastlines looked completely different. Land bridges appeared where oceans exist today. The world was smaller and stranger and colder than anything you have experienced on your most miserable winter morning. But here is the thing that surprises most people. The Ice Age world was not entirely frozen solid. Vast regions between the glaciers, particularly across what is now Siberia, Alaska, and parts of Europe, were covered not in ice, but in something almost more alien to modern eyes. Grassland. Dry, cold, wind-swept grassland, stretching in every direction. Scientists have a name for this place. They call it the Mammoth Steppe. And we will be spending a good deal of tonight wandering through it. The temperature on the Mammoth Steppe was not the kind of cold that makes you reach for an extra blanket. We are talking about average winter temperatures that could drop to minus 40 degrees Celsius. The wind did not so much blow as scour. The growing season was brutally short. And yet, somehow, this landscape supported one of the most diverse and dramatic collections of large animals that has ever walked the earth. Woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, cave lions, giant deer with antlers spanning 3.5 meters, short-faced bears, hyenas with bone-crushing jaws. It was, in a word, busy, and standing above all of it, not because it was the most aggressive, not because it was the fastest, and certainly not because it was the most terrifying, was the woolly mammoth. The woolly mammoth, known scientifically as Mammoths primigenius, first appeared somewhere around 400,000 years ago, evolving from earlier mammoth species that had spread out of Africa and across Eurasia. By the time the last great glacial maximum peaked, roughly 20 to 25,000 years ago, woolly mammoths had spread across an almost incomprehensible range. They lived in what is now Spain and roamed across Russia and walked the frozen plains of North America. One species, one animal, covering most of the northern hemisphere. That kind of range does not happen by accident. It happens because an animal is extraordinarily, almost absurdly well-suited to its environment. But here is what you might not immediately expect. The mammoth's dominance was not just about physical toughness, it was about engineering. Mammoths did not simply survive the Ice Age world. They actively helped shape it. They were, in the language of modern ecology, a keystone species, meaning that their presence fundamentally altered the landscape around them in ways that benefited dozens of other species. Remove the mammoth, and the whole ecosystem began to unravel. We will get into exactly how that worked as tonight unfolds. There is rather a lot to cover, and some of it is going to surprise you. For now, though, just settle in. You are standing on the edge of that frozen steppe, and the wind is low tonight. Somewhere ahead, you can just make out the silhouette of a mammoth moving slowly through the pale grass. It is enormous. It is calm, and it is entirely at home in a world that would defeat you within hours. That is the thing about mammoths. The cold was not their enemy. The cold was their kingdom. There is a particular kind of engineering that only extreme environments produce. When the world applies enough pressure, enough cold, enough wind, enough scarcity, living things either disappear or they transform into something almost purpose-built for survival. The woolly mammoth was the result of hundreds of thousands of years of exactly that kind of pressure, and the outcome was an animal so precisely designed for frozen landscapes that modern engineers, if they are being honest, would find the whole thing quietly impressive. You are still standing on that step. The wind has picked up slightly, carrying with it the faint, dry smell of frozen grass and distant ice. And now, closer than before, you can see the mammoth properly, not as a silhouette anymore, but as a real, breathing, astonishing thing. The first detail that strikes you is the sheer size. A fully grown male, woolly mammoth stood roughly 3 to 3.5 meters tall at the shoulder and weighed somewhere between 6 and 8 metric tons. For comparison, that is heavier than most modern African elephants, which are already the largest land animals alive today. This was not a creature that needed to worry much about being pushed around. But size alone does not explain cold weather dominance. Size actually creates a problem in cold climates, because larger bodies need more fuel. The mammoth solved this and several other engineering challenges in ways that are worth walking through slowly, because each one is more interesting than the last. Start with the ears. Modern African elephants have enormous ears, and for good reason. Those ears are essentially radiators. Blood flows through the thin skin of the ears, releases heat into the surrounding air, and returns to the body cooler. In the African savanna, this is brilliant. On the Siberian steppe, at -40 degrees, it would be catastrophic. Woolly mammoths had dramatically smaller ears than their modern relatives. Significantly reduced surface area meant dramatically less heat loss. It sounds like a small detail, but in extreme cold, small details are the difference between surviving a night and not surviving it. The skull and neck structure of the mammoth also show clear cold weather adaptations. The characteristic high-domed head that makes mammoth skulls so recognizable was not decorative. It served as an anchor point for the enormous neck muscles required to swing the head side to side during a behavior called grubbing, using the tusks and head to sweep snow aside and expose the frozen grass beneath. This was not an occasional behavior. This was how mammoths found food for a significant portion of every winter, and doing it efficiently required serious muscular infrastructure. Now, here is the part that surprises most people. Mammoths had a specialized fat deposit sitting directly on top of their skulls, just beneath the skin. This hump of fat served a dual purpose. It provided an energy reserve during lean winter months, and it also acted as a kind of insulating cap for the brain, one of the most temperature-sensitive organs in any mammal. Scientists still debate the precise function of this fat deposit, with some researchers arguing its primary role was structural rather than thermal, but the insulating benefit in extreme cold would have been significant regardless of the original evolutionary intent. But things are about to get more interesting, because mammoths were not just insulated on the outside, they were chemically adapted on the inside. Here is a lesser-known fact that tends to produce a satisfying moment of surprise. The hemoglobin, the protein in red blood cells that carries oxygen, of woolly mammoths, had a unique genetic mutation that allowed it to release oxygen efficiently, even at very low body temperatures. In most mammals, including modern elephants, hemoglobin becomes less effective at delivering oxygen to tissues as body temperature drops. Cold slows things down. But mammoth hemoglobin had a structural tweak that kept it functioning well in the cold, essentially solving one of the fundamental physiological problems of living in a frozen environment. Researchers identified this by recovering ancient mammoth DNA and actually recreating the mammoth hemoglobin protein in the laboratory, then measuring its properties directly. It is one of the more extraordinary things that paleogenetics has produced in the last 2 decades, and it quietly confirms that mammoth cold adaptation went all the way down to the molecular level. The legs and feet of the mammoth were another study in cold weather practicality. The feet were broad and cushioned, designed to distribute that enormous weight across soft or uneven terrain, important on ground that shifted between frozen solid and unexpectedly boggy, depending on season. The legs themselves were shorter relative to body size than those of modern elephants, which lowered the center of gravity and made movement through deep snow more stable. You can think of it as the Ice Age equivalent of wearing snowshoes, except the snowshoes were built into the skeleton. Paleontologists continue to argue about the exact walking speed and movement patterns of woolly mammoths. Some biomechanical models suggest they were surprisingly agile for their size, capable of a reasonably swift trot when motivated. Others argue their build favored slow, energy-efficient plodding over long distances. The honest answer is that we do not entirely know, and the truth probably varied depending on age, terrain, and whether something large and hungry was following them, which on the Pleistocene steppe was not an unreasonable concern. There is something calming about observing the mammoth now that you understand its construction a little better. It is not struggling against the cold. It is not huddled against the wind, looking miserable. It moves through the frozen landscape with the relaxed, deliberate confidence of something that has been shaped over hundreds of thousands of years, specifically for this moment, this temperature, this world. Every part of it, from the reduced ears to the chemical structure of its blood, is doing exactly what it was designed to do. The cold is not something the mammoth endures. The cold is something the mammoth wears, and it wears it exceptionally well. Most people, when they picture a woolly mammoth, picture something that looks roughly like a very large, very hairy elephant. Brown fur, long tusks, cold weather. That is the general impression, and it is not wrong exactly, but it is the kind of description that leaves out almost everything interesting. because the mammoth's coat was not simply fur. It was a sophisticated, multi-layered thermal system that took millions of years to develop and would genuinely impress anyone who has ever spent serious time thinking about insulation. You reach out a hand, hypothetically, because the mammoth you are observing is very large and only hypothetically friendly, and what you would feel first is not what you might expect. The outermost layer of a mammoth's coat was composed of long, coarse, guard hairs that could reach lengths of up to 90 centimeters in some individuals, nearly a meter of hair. These guard hairs were not soft. They were stiff and somewhat oily, and their primary job was not warmth. Their job was to act as a weather shield, deflecting wind, repelling moisture, and preventing the deeper, more delicate layers beneath from becoming wet or compacted. Think of them as the mammoth's outer jacket, functional, utilitarian, and not particularly comfortable to touch. Beneath the guard hairs was a layer of coarser, shorter fur, sometimes described as a middle coat, which provided structural separation between the outer weather layer and the inner insulation. And beneath that, this is where it gets genuinely interesting, was a dense, fine undercoat of woolly fiber, packed tightly against the skin, trapping warm air in thousands of tiny pockets, the way a high-quality sleeping bag traps air between its fibers. This undercoat was soft, fine, and remarkably similar in structure to the wool of modern cold-adapted sheep, which is not entirely coincidental, since both evolved under similar thermal pressures. The combined thickness of all three layers could exceed 10 centimeters in well-insulated individuals during peak winter condition. That is not fur. That is architecture. Here is the lesser-known detail that tends to change how people visualize mammoths. The color of the mammoth's coat was almost certainly not the uniform dark brown that appears in most illustrations and museum reconstructions. Analysis of preserved mammoth hair and actual mammoth hair has survived in permafrost samples in remarkable condition, suggests that coat color varied considerably between individuals and likely changed with age. Some mammoths appear to have had reddish-brown coats. Others were darker, closer to black. Some specimens show evidence of paler, almost sandy coloration. There is a reasonable possibility that older mammoths became lighter in color as they aged. Similar to the way some mammals show age-related coat changes today, scientists still debate whether mammoth coat color served any significant role in social signaling or camouflage, or whether the variation was simply neutral genetic drift with no particular adaptive purpose. Some researchers have proposed that lighter coloration in older animals might have been visible enough to help younger herd members identify and follow experienced adults across long distances on open steppe terrain. Others find this explanation unconvincing. The debate remains genuinely open, which is one of the things that makes mammoth science perpetually interesting. But here is something nobody debates. The mammoth's skin beneath all that fur was also significantly adapted for cold. Preserved skin samples show that mammoth skin was notably thick, thicker than modern elephant skin, and contained dense concentrations of sebaceous glands, producing natural oils that waterproofed the coat from the inside out. This was important because wet insulation is dramatically less effective than dry insulation. A mammoth caught in sleet or freezing rain needed its coat to shed moisture efficiently or risk a dangerous drop in core body temperature. The combination of oily skin, stiff guard hairs, and tightly packed undercoat created a system remarkably resistant to moisture penetration. There is also evidence, drawn from analysis of frozen mammoth specimens, that the distribution of fat beneath the skin was not uniform. mammoths appear to have carried heavier fat deposits along the back, flanks, and rump, the areas most exposed to wind and cold, while areas protected by the legs and underside carried thinner fat layers. This is a pattern seen in other cold-adapted large mammals, and suggests the mammoth's body was not simply responding to cold in a general way, but doing so with a kind of regional precision. And here is where things get quietly strange. Despite all of this extraordinary insulation, mammoths could apparently overheat. Specimens discovered in exceptional preservation occasionally show features that researchers interpret as potential heat dissipation structures. Patches of the body where fur was notably thinner or shorter, possibly allowing selective heat release during periods of intense physical activity. Moving an 8-ton body through deep snow at speed generates an enormous amount of metabolic heat, and a system that keeps you alive at -40 can become a serious problem when you are working hard. Nature has a persistent sense of irony. The thing that keeps you alive in the cold can also threaten you with overheating when you run. The mammoth you are watching has settled into a slow, rhythmic pace now, its coat shifting in the light breeze, in layers you can almost distinguish from here. The guard hairs catch the low sunlight and hold it for a moment before the next gust moves them. Beneath them, you know now, is a world of careful engineering. Warmth preserved, moisture repelled, cold transformed from a threat into a background condition so thoroughly managed it barely registers. The mammoth does not shiver, it simply walks. There is a philosophical question that occasionally surfaces in paleontology, usually late in the evening when researchers have been staring at bones for too long. It goes something like this. If you could choose one single feature of an extinct animal to study in complete detail, what would you choose? For a surprising number of mammoth researchers, the answer is not the tusks, not the teeth, not the impressive skeletal frame. It is the trunk. Because the mammoth's trunk, that long, improbable, slightly absurd-looking appendage that elephants and their relatives have carried through millions of years of evolution, was not simply a nose. It was a Swiss Army knife, made of muscle, and understanding it properly changes how you think about mammoth survival entirely. You are still moving across the steppe, and the mammoth ahead has paused. Its trunk is sweeping slowly across the surface of the snow, not randomly, but with a kind of methodical patience that suggests purpose. You watch for a moment and realize it is reading the ground, smelling it, feeling it, processing it in ways that your comparatively limited sensory apparatus could not begin to replicate. The trunk of a woolly mammoth was composed of somewhere in the region of 100,000 individual muscle units. There are no bones inside it, none. The entire structure is pure muscular and connective tissue, which means it is simultaneously enormously strong and extraordinarily precise. A mammoth could use its trunk to uproot a tree and also to pick up a single blade of grass. That range of application, from raw power to delicate manipulation, is almost unmatched in the animal kingdom and represents one of evolution's more elegant solutions to the problem of interacting with a highly variable world. For cold weather survival specifically, the trunk solved several problems at once. The first and most obvious was breathing. Cold air is damaging to lung tissue when inhaled directly. The long nasal passage of the mammoth's trunk warmed and humidified incoming air before it reached the lungs, functioning in essentially the same way as the long nasal passages in other cold-adapted mammals. Breathing at -40 degrees through a long, warm, muscular tube is dramatically less damaging to respiratory tissue than breathing through a short, exposed nose. The trunk was, among other things, a very effective air conditioning system running in reverse. The trunk also served as the mammoth's primary tool for winter foraging. Remember that behavior mentioned earlier, grubbing, the sweeping motion used to clear snow from frozen grass? The trunk was central to this process. A mammoth foraging in winter would use a combination of tusk sweeps and trunk movements to clear patches of snow, then use the sensitive tip of the trunk to locate edible vegetation beneath. The tip of the mammoth trunk, based on comparisons with modern elephant anatomy and analysis of preserved specimens, likely had two finger-like projections of muscle that allowed remarkably precise grasping. The mammoth could essentially feel its way through frozen ground cover, identifying edible material by texture and smell simultaneously. Here is the lesser-known detail that tends to produce a quiet moment of wonder. Elephant trunks, and almost certainly mammoth trunks by close relation, contain sensory receptors sensitive enough to detect the chemical signatures of water sources from significant distances. Modern elephants have been observed locating underground water sources by pressing their trunks against dry ground and detecting moisture far below the surface. On the Pleistocene steppe, where water sources froze solid for months at a time, this ability to locate liquid water or assess the depth of ice over frozen rivers would have been genuinely life-saving. The trunk was not just a feeding tool, it was a survival sensor. But things get stranger still, because the trunk also appears to have played a significant role in mammoth social communication. Modern elephants produce a range of sounds through their trunks: trumpeting, rumbling, low-frequency vibrations, and use them for everything from alarm calls to long-distance communication between separated herd members. Mammoths almost certainly did the same. Some researchers have proposed that mammoths, like modern elephants, communicated partially through infrasound, low-frequency vibrations below the threshold of human hearing, that could travel several kilometers across open steppe terrain. If this is accurate, and scientists continue to debate the extent to which mammoth communication mirrored that of modern elephants, then the trunk was also a broadcasting antenna, sending and receiving signals across the frozen landscape in frequencies you would never hear standing right beside one. There is something quietly humbling about that image. You are standing 100 meters from a mammoth on an open plain, watching it forage in the snow, and the entire time it may be conducting a detailed conversation with herd members several kilometers away in a frequency range your ears cannot access. Paleontologists continue to argue about the degree of vocal complexity in mammoth communication, with some researchers suggesting it was comparable to modern elephant communication, and others urging caution about extrapolating too directly from living relatives. The honest position is that the trunk's role in mammoth social life remains one of the more genuinely uncertain aspects of the animal's behavior. What is not uncertain is the mechanical brilliance of the structure itself. 100,000 muscle units, no bones, sensitive enough to read frozen ground, strong enough to strip bark from a tree, long enough to warm incoming air to safe temperatures, capable of broadcasting sound across kilometers of open steppe. The mammoth ahead lifts its trunk briefly into the wind, holds it there for a moment in that characteristic elephant posture of deep olfactory attention, then lowers it again and continues walking. It has smelled something interesting, or someone approaching, or perhaps nothing at all, and it is simply checking, the way you might glance at your phone out of habit. Even mammoths, it turns out, had their own version of idle checking. There is a particular challenge built into being very large and very warm in a very cold place. The challenge is fuel. An 8-ton animal wrapped in 10 centimeters of insulating fur, maintaining a stable core temperature against a climate that regularly drops to -40, is burning an extraordinary amount of metabolic energy simply by existing. Add to that the physical demands of walking across frozen ground, sweeping snow aside to find food, and navigating a landscape that offers almost nothing easy, and you begin to appreciate that the mammoth's relationship with food was not casual. It was constant, strategic, and absolutely central to everything else the animal did. You have been walking for a while now, following at a respectful distance, and you notice that the mammoth ahead has not stopped moving since you first spotted it. It walks, it sweeps, it grazes, it moves on. There is no resting in the middle of the day, no long afternoon pause in the shade, partly because there is very little shade, and partly because the mammoth simply cannot afford the luxury of stillness. Fueling that body is essentially a full-time occupation. The diet of the woolly mammoth was primarily composed of grasses, sedges, and herbaceous flowering plants. The low-growing, cold-tolerant vegetation that dominated the mammoth steppe. This is confirmed not just by logical inference from the landscape, but by direct physical evidence. Preserved mammoth stomach contents have been recovered from frozen specimens in Siberia and provide a remarkably specific picture of what individual animals were eating in the final hours before they died. Grass, sedge, flowers, occasional woody material from shrubs. The diet was not dramatically different from what a modern horse or bison might eat. Scaled up considerably in quantity, and the quantity was considerable. Estimates based on metabolic modeling suggest that a large adult mammoth needed to consume somewhere between 180 and 270 kilograms of vegetation per day to maintain body weight and energy balance. That is roughly the weight of 2 to 3 average adult humans, consumed in plant matter every single day. Finding that much food on a frozen steppe in the middle of winter was not a trivial exercise. Here is the surprising, lesser-known detail. Mammoths were not simply passive grazers, moving across whatever vegetation happened to be available. There is growing evidence that mammoths actively modified their foraging areas in ways that increased food availability over time. By sweeping snow aside, they exposed frozen grass that other animals could then also access, effectively creating shared foraging patches. Their heavy footfalls broke up compacted snow and disturbed soil in ways that may have encouraged faster regrowth of vegetation in spring. Some researchers have described mammoths as functioning like slow, enormous gardeners. Not intentionally, but effectively, scientists still debate the full extent of mammoth ecosystem engineering, with some paleontologists arguing the evidence for active landscape modification is compelling, and others suggesting it overstates the intentionality of what was essentially just hungry animals eating. The distinction between an animal that happens to modify its environment and an animal that actively manages it is genuinely difficult to establish from fossil evidence alone. But what is well established is the mechanical sophistication of how mammoths actually processed their food. The teeth of the woolly mammoth were among the most specialized grinding structures in mammal evolutionary history. Each molar was a broad, ridged platform composed of multiple enamel plates bound together by a material called cementum, creating a surface ideally suited to the lateral grinding motion required to break down tough, gritty, silica-rich grasses. Grass is actually one of the more mechanically demanding foods a large herbivore can choose, partly because it contains microscopic silica particles that function essentially as tiny pieces of sandpaper, gradually wearing down tooth surfaces with every bite. Mammoths addressed this problem by cycling through 6 sets of teeth over a lifetime. The molars did not grow in simultaneously, but moved forward through the jaw in a slow conveyor belt process, with new molars replacing worn ones from behind. This system, shared with modern elephants, effectively gave the mammoth multiple lifetimes' worth of grinding surface spread across a single lifetime. The catch, and there is always a catch, was that once the final set of molars was worn down, the animal could no longer process food effectively and would eventually starve. Analysis of older mammoth specimens suggests that dental failure was likely a significant cause of natural death in aging individuals, which is a rather unglamorous ending for an animal that spent its entire life being impressively cold adapted. The mammoth ahead pauses now at a patch of ground where the snow is thinner, worn away by wind into a shallow depression, exposing pale, frost-stiffened grass beneath. The trunk sweeps across it, the tusks tilt slightly, and the animal begins to feed with a methodical patience that feels almost meditative. Bite, chew, grind. The jaw moves in that distinctive lateral motion, those extraordinary ridged molars doing their slow, precise work. There is something deeply soothing about watching a large animal eat with complete absorption. No urgency, no drama, just the quiet, purposeful business of fueling an enormous body in a cold world. The wind shifts slightly, carrying a faint sweetness from somewhere, thawed vegetation in a south-facing hollow, perhaps. Warmed briefly by the low winter sun, the mammoth's trunk rises, catches it, holds it, and then, without any obvious hurry, the animal begins moving in that direction. It always knows where the food is. It always has. There is a category of things that no longer exist, but whose absence is large enough to leave a shape in the world, a gap where something enormous used to be. The mammoth steppe is one of those things. It was not simply a habitat, it was the largest terrestrial ecosystem on Earth during the peak of the last glacial maximum, stretching in an almost unbroken band from the Atlantic coast of Europe, across Russia and Siberia, over the land bridge that connected Asia to North America, and deep into the interior of the continent that would eventually become Alaska and the Yukon. It covered more ground than any single ecosystem existing on Earth today, and it is completely gone. The steppe you have been walking through tonight is a fragment of that world, reconstructed from fossil records, ancient pollen samples, permafrost analysis, and the preserved remains of the animals that lived here. Real enough for tonight's purposes, but gone in every practical sense. Understanding why it existed, what made it function, and what its disappearance meant is one of the more important and quietly melancholy stories in all of natural history. The mammoth steppe was, at its heart, a grassland, not a lush, temperate grassland like the American prairies that exist today, but a drier, colder, more severe version, a landscape dominated by grasses, sedges, and low herbaceous plants that had evolved to survive in conditions most vegetation cannot tolerate. The soil beneath it was a deep, rich permafrost underlain by a layer of nutrient-dense, frozen ground that preserved organic material for thousands of years without decomposing. This frozen organic layer is part of why mammoth remains have survived in such extraordinary condition. The steppe essentially functioned as a giant natural freezer, preserving everything it claimed. The diversity of large animals supported by this ecosystem is, by modern standards, almost bewildering. Alongside the woolly mammoth walked woolly rhinoceroses, cave lions, cave hyenas, giant deer, steppe bison, wild horses, saiga antelope, and musk oxen. Predators included not just the cave lion, but the cave bear, various wolf species, and increasingly, as the epoch progressed, a particular primate that had recently arrived from the south with sharp tools and a troubling amount of ingenuity. The mammoth steppe was not a quiet, empty place. It was dense with life in ways that would surprise anyone who pictures the Ice Age as a barren wasteland. Here is the lesser-known detail that reframes the entire ecosystem. The mammoth steppe was not simply a place where animals lived. The animals were, in a very real ecological sense, the reason the steppe existed at all. Large grazing herds, mammoths, bison, horses, maintained the grassland by consuming vegetation before it could transition into shrubland or sparse forest. Their hooves broke up soil and allowed water to penetrate more deeply. Their dung fertilized the ground and seeded new growth across enormous distances. Their bodies, when they died, returned enormous quantities of nutrients to the soil in concentrated patches that supported localized bursts of plant diversity. This is the concept ecologists call a grazing ecosystem, and its modern analog is the African savanna, where large herbivore herds maintain open grassland that would otherwise transition to woodland. Remove the grazers, and the ecosystem shifts. The mammoth steppe was essentially the Ice Age version of the Serengeti, and the mammoth was its elephant, the keystone species whose presence held the whole structure together. Scientists still debate the precise mechanisms by which mammoth grazing maintained steppe conditions, with some researchers arguing that megafaunal grazing pressure was the dominant factor in keeping the landscape open, and others suggesting that climate was the primary driver and the animals were passengers rather than architects. This debate has significant implications for modern conservation biology because it touches on the question of whether reintroducing large grazers to degraded landscapes can genuinely restore lost ecosystems. Some researchers, most notably the team behind the Pleistocene Park project in Siberia, are actively testing this idea today by reintroducing large herbivores to permafrost landscapes to see whether animal activity can slow permafrost thaw. But here is where things get quietly fascinating. The mammoth steppe was also a carbon storage system of almost incomprehensible scale. The frozen organic material locked in permafrost beneath the steppe represented billions of tons of sequestered carbon that had been accumulating undisturbed for tens of thousands of years. As long as the permafrost remained frozen, that carbon stayed locked away. The moment the permafrost began to thaw, it started releasing that carbon into the atmosphere. The connection between the disappearance of the mammoth, the collapse of the mammoth steppe, and the release of ancient permafrost carbon is one of the more sobering threads in the whole story, and we will return to it later in tonight's journey. For now, though, just take in the scale of what surrounds you. The steppe extends to every horizon without interruption. The sky above it is enormous and pale and cold. Somewhere to the north, a glacier catches the last light of a low winter sun and holds it for a moment in a blue that has no modern equivalent. This ecosystem took millions of years to build. It supported life on a scale that staggers the imagination, and it existed in full, magnificent operation, right up until the moment it did not. The mammoth grazing ahead of you does not know any of this, of course. It simply eats and walks and breathes warm fog into the cold air. But it is holding up an entire world. There is a tendency, when thinking about prehistoric megafauna, to imagine them as solitary, silent presences moving through an empty landscape with the blank purposefulness of very large machines. Big bodies, small inner lives. impressive from a distance but not particularly interesting up close. This impression is wrong about most Ice Age animals, and it is spectacularly wrong about mammoths, because mammoths, as far as the evidence allows us to reconstruct, had social lives that were rich, structured, emotionally complex, and occasionally quite dramatic in ways that feel surprisingly familiar. The mammoth you have been following has not been alone this whole time, though you may not have fully noticed. Look to the left, perhaps 200 meters distant, and there is another one, slightly smaller, moving in the same general direction, at the same unhurried pace, and further beyond that, barely visible through the pale haze of blowing snow, the dark shapes of several more. You have not been observing a lone animal. You have been on the edge of a herd. The social structure of woolly mammoths was almost certainly matriarchal, organized around family groups led by older females in a pattern essentially identical to that of modern African and Asian elephants. This inference is drawn from multiple lines of evidence. The close evolutionary relationship between mammoths and modern elephants makes behavioral similarity highly probable. Fossil assemblages, groupings of mammoth bones found together, frequently show patterns consistent with family group composition, with multiple ages and sizes represented together. And the sheer ecological logic of matriarchal organization supports it. In a landscape where knowing the location of seasonal food sources, water, and safe travel routes was genuinely life-saving information, older females with decades of accumulated knowledge were an irreplaceable resource. A typical mammoth family group likely consisted of between 6 and 12 individuals: a senior female, her daughters, their offspring, and possibly sisters or other close female relatives. Young males would have remained with the family group until reaching a certain age, somewhere between the early and mid-teens, before being gradually pushed to the periphery and eventually departing to live in loose bachelor groups or as solitary wanderers. This pattern mirrors modern elephant social organization so closely that most researchers treat it as well-established rather than speculative. Here is the lesser-known detail that adds unexpected emotional texture to the picture. There is physical evidence suggesting that mammoths, like modern elephants, responded to the deaths of herd members in ways that go beyond simple biological indifference. Several fossil sites have produced groupings of mammoth bones, showing signs of disturbance, consistent with other mammoths having interacted with the remains, repositioning bones, returning repeatedly to the same location, lingering near the bodies of fallen individuals. Modern elephants are well documented to exhibit mourning-like behaviors around the remains of other elephants, including members of other family groups. Whether mammoth behavior was cognitively comparable to modern elephant grief is a question that cannot be definitively answered from fossil evidence alone. But the physical patterns are suggestive enough that researchers take them seriously. Scientists still debate the degree to which mammoth social cognition paralleled that of modern elephants, with some paleontologists arguing that the behavioral evidence strongly supports comparable emotional complexity, and others urging caution about projecting modern animal psychology onto extinct species. It is a debate that probably cannot be fully resolved, which makes it one of the more philosophically interesting corners of mammoth research. The drama of mammoth social life was not limited to quiet family dynamics, however, because there were also the males. Adult male mammoths periodically entered a state called must, a condition well documented in modern elephants and characterized by dramatically elevated testosterone levels, aggressive behavior, distinctive physical secretions from glands near the temples, and an overwhelming drive to seek out and compete for reproductive access to females. A male mammoth in Mammoths was not a relaxed, gentle grazer. It was a several-ton animal in a state of hormonal intensity that made it aggressive toward other males, unpredictable around humans, and capable of remarkable feats of physical violence in competition with rivals. Fossil evidence for mammoth combat is surprisingly abundant. Mammoth tusks show damage patterns consistent with locking against another animal's tusks and twisting, the classic pushing and wrestling behavior seen in modern elephant confrontations. Some specimens show healed injuries that would have required surviving serious physical trauma. A few extraordinary finds preserve two sets of mammoth tusks apparently locked together, the animals having died entangled in each other, which suggests that male competition occasionally reached genuinely dangerous intensity. The tusks themselves, in fact, deserve their own moment of attention here. They were not primarily feeding tools, though they were certainly used for moving snow and digging. They were social instruments. Their size, curvature, and condition communicated information about age, health, and competitive status to every other mammoth in visual range. A large, symmetrical, undamaged set of tusks advertised years of successful survival and competitive experience. In the mathematics of mammoth reproduction, impressive tusks were a form of currency. The herd has drifted closer now while you are watching, and you can hear, faintly, the low rumbling communication passing between individuals, felt more than heard, a vibration in the cold air that settles somewhere in your chest. The senior female moves with a particular authority, the others adjusting their positions subtly around her without any obvious signal. She knows where she is going. She has been here before, probably many times, in other winters long past. The family follows, as they always have. There is a comfortable fantasy that comes with imagining the woolly mammoth at the top of the Ice Age world, an 8-ton animal wrapped in 10 centimeters of insulation, equipped with tusks that could reshape a landscape, traveling in protective family groups led by experienced matriarchs. It is easy to picture such an animal as essentially untouchable, a creature so formidable that everything else on the Pleistocene steppe simply moved aside and let it pass. The reality was considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting because the mammoth steppe was populated by an extraordinary cast of large, capable, and occasionally terrifying animals that had their own agendas entirely. The wind has shifted tonight, and somewhere upwind of where you are standing, something has changed in the quality of the silence. The herd you have been observing has noticed it too. The senior female has raised her head. Her trunk is extended, reading the air with that same focused attention you watched earlier. The younger animals have drawn slightly closer together without any visible instruction. Something is out there. The apex predator most frequently associated with the mammoth's world is the cave lion, Panthera spelaea, and it deserves its reputation. Cave lions were not simply large domestic cats, scaled up to inconvenient proportions. They were among the largest felids that have ever existed, significantly bigger than modern African lions, with some estimates placing large males at over 300 kilograms. They were also, based on cave art left by the humans who shared their world, clearly recognized as something serious. Paleolithic artists depicted cave lions with a specificity and frequency that suggests genuine familiarity and possibly genuine wariness. Cave lions almost certainly did not regularly attempt to take down fully healthy adult mammoths. The risk-to-reward calculation does not work in their favor. A healthy adult mammoth is simply too dangerous, too massive, and too well defended by herd members to represent a sensible hunting target for even a large predator. But young mammoths, elderly individuals, sick animals, and those separated from their herds represented a different proposition entirely. Predator pressure on vulnerable mammoth individuals was real, and it influenced herd behavior in ways that are still visible in the fossil record. The protective clustering behavior you just observed from the herd was not an accident. It was an ancient, deeply practiced response. The woolly rhinoceros deserves mention here as a rival rather than a predator, not a hunter of mammoths, but a fellow megafaunal heavyweight sharing the same landscape and the same resources. Woolly rhinoceroses, Coelodonta antiquitatis, were roughly 2 tons of armored, bad-tempered herbivore, equipped with 2 impressive horns and a demonstrated willingness to use them. They shared significant dietary overlap with mammoths, grazing the same frozen grasslands and competing for the same cleared foraging patches. Whether mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses had direct aggressive encounters is not clearly established in the fossil record, but the ecological pressure of sharing limited winter food resources with another large grazer was a constant feature of mammoth life. Here is the lesser-known detail that shifts the threat landscape considerably. One of the more significant dangers facing mammoths on the Pleistocene steppe was not a predator at all. It was the ground itself. Seasonal thaw cycles created zones of unstable, waterlogged terrain, areas where the surface layer of permafrost melted during warmer months and created a boggy, treacherous substrate that could trap large animals with devastating efficiency. Numerous mammoth fossil sites represent not hunting kills or natural deaths from cold or starvation, but animals that became mired in soft ground and could not free themselves. The sheer weight that made the mammoth so imposing in most contexts became catastrophic liability the moment the ground beneath it stopped being solid. Scientists still debate the relative contribution of bog entrapment to overall mammoth mortality, with some researchers arguing it was a significant and underappreciated cause of death, and others suggesting most mired specimens represent animals that died from other causes and were subsequently preserved in favorable waterlogged conditions. The distinction matters for understanding mammoth population dynamics, but the honest answer is that both scenarios were probably real, and neither fully excludes the other. The scavenger community of the mammoth steppe also deserves a moment's consideration, because a dead mammoth was not simply a tragedy, it was an ecological event. The sheer quantity of calories represented by an 8-ton carcass attracted every capable scavenger within sensory range: cave hyenas, wolves, various bear species, and eventually humans, who were increasingly sophisticated in their ability to locate and exploit large carcasses. The bones of mammoth kill sites and scavenging sites show the overlapping marks of multiple species, a palimpsest of feeding activity that sometimes takes researchers considerable effort to disentangle. The senior female has relaxed slightly now. Whatever she smelled on the wind has either moved away or been assessed and dismissed. The herd resumes its slow forward movement, the tension dissolving as quietly as it arrived. The younger animals spread out again into their loose traveling formation, the brief moment of collective alertness already fading into the rhythm of walking. You notice something in watching this. The herd's response to a potential threat was not panic. It was a measured, practiced adjustment, a closing of ranks, an assessment, a decision. These were not animals living in constant terror of their world. They were animals that understood their world well enough to respond to it with calibrated precision. The mammoth steppe was dangerous, but the mammoth knew exactly how dangerous, and it had spent hundreds of thousands of years learning exactly what to do about it. There is a moment in the relationship between humans and mammoths that no fossil can fully capture, but that must have happened thousands of times across the Pleistocene. A small group of people standing on the edge of the steppe in the early morning cold, looking out at a herd of animals, each of which outweighs their entire group combined, and making a decision. Not a panicked decision, not a desperate one, a considered, deliberate, strategically sophisticated decision about whether, when, and how to attempt something that, by any physical measure, should have been impossible. Hunting a mammoth with stone-tipped spears and collective ingenuity against several tons of cold-adapted muscle was not a casual undertaking. And yet, across thousands of years and dozens of cultures, people did it regularly enough that it left a clear and permanent mark on the archaeological record. The relationship between early humans and woolly mammoths is one of the most complex and debated topics in all of Pleistocene research, and it is worth approaching carefully because the popular narrative, humans arrived, hunted mammoths, to extinction moved on, is a dramatic oversimplification of something far more nuanced and interesting. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, arrived in mammoth territory in a gradual, geographically uneven process that unfolded over tens of thousands of years. In Europe, anatomically modern humans began moving into mammoth-inhabited landscapes roughly 45,000 years ago, overlapping for a significant period with Neanderthals, who had their own long-established relationships with the megafauna of the region. In Siberia, and eventually across the Bering Land Bridge into North America, the human arrival into mammoth territory came later, somewhere between 15 and 20,000 years ago, for the deepest interior regions. Though the exact timing remains actively debated, the tools these people brought with them were not primitive in any meaningful sense of the word. Paleolithic hunters were sophisticated, experienced, and working within a knowledge tradition that had been accumulating for tens of thousands of years. Their spear points, carefully knapped from flint, obsidian, or other fine-grained stone, were precision instruments capable of penetrating the hide of a large animal when driven with sufficient force. Their hunting strategies, inferred from kill sites and landscape analysis, included driving animals toward natural traps, ambushing individuals separated from herds, targeting vulnerable animals at water sources, and coordinating group attacks that compensated for individual human physical limitations through collective intelligence. Here is the lesser-known detail that reframes how we think about human-mammoth interaction. The majority of mammoth remains at archaeological sites show evidence of scavenging rather than active hunting. Cut marks from stone tools appear on bones alongside the gnaw marks of carnivores and the damage patterns of animals that died from non-human causes. This does not mean humans never actively hunted mammoths. Clear evidence of hunting kills exists at several sites, but it does suggest that opportunistic scavenging of naturally deceased or predator-killed mammoths was at least as important as active hunting in the human-mammoth relationship. A freshly dead mammoth represented an almost incomprehensible quantity of food, fat, hide, bone, and ivory, and a group of humans capable of locating and safely accessing such a carcass before competing scavengers consumed it entirely would have been at a significant survival advantage. Scientists still debate the proportion of active hunting versus scavenging in human mammoth exploitation, with some researchers arguing that the evidence for systematic mammoth hunting is robust and widespread, and others suggesting it has been overstated by researchers drawn to the more dramatic interpretation. The debate is complicated by the difficulty of distinguishing hunting kill sites from scavenging sites when both involve similar tool use on similar bone material. But the human relationship with mammoths extended far beyond food. This is the part of the story that tends to shift how people think about Paleolithic life entirely. Mammoth ivory was carved into figurines, beads, and ornamental objects of remarkable sophistication. Some of the oldest known musical instruments, simple flutes, were carved from mammoth ivory. Mammoth bone was used to construct shelters, to fuel fires in treeless landscapes where wood was scarce, and to create elaborate burial sites for the dead. In cultures where mammoths were abundant, the animal was not simply a food source, it was infrastructure, it was art material, it was, in a very real sense, civilization's raw material. The people moving across the same steppe you have been traveling tonight were not primitive beings, stumbling through a hostile world. They were highly adapted, culturally sophisticated, deeply knowledgeable inhabitants of the same landscape the mammoths ruled. They knew the migration routes, they knew the seasonal patterns, they knew which animals were vulnerable and which were not. They had been accumulating this knowledge, passing it down through generations of oral tradition and practical experience for longer than recorded history. The herd ahead has shifted direction slightly, moving toward lower ground where the snow is thinner and the exposed grass more accessible. You notice now, on the horizon behind you, the faint suggestion of a small fire. Someone else is watching this herd tonight. They have been watching herds like this for a very long time. The fire on the horizon is closer now than it was a few moments ago, which means whoever lit it is moving, following the same herd you have been following, navigating the frozen steppe with a confidence that speaks of long familiarity with this particular kind of darkness and this particular kind of cold. You find yourself walking toward the fire rather than away from it, drawn by the same ancient instinct that has made firelight irresistible to humans for as long as humans have existed. And when you get close enough to see what the fire is burning beside, you stop, because the structure next to it is unlike anything in your modern experience, and it takes a moment to fully process what you are looking at. It is a house, of sorts, not a cave, not a simple skin tent stretched over wooden poles, but a carefully engineered dwelling constructed almost entirely from the bones of woolly mammoths. Enormous curved tusks form the arching entrance. Massive leg bones and shoulder blades have been arranged into walls. Skulls, some of them nearly a meter across, serve as foundation elements and structural supports. The whole thing is covered in hides and sod, creating an insulated, wind-resistant interior space that is, by the standards of a frozen steppe in the middle of a glacial maximum, remarkably comfortable. This is not imagination or artistic license. These structures are real, and the archaeological evidence for them is extraordinary. Across a broad region of what is now Ukraine, Russia, and the Czech Republic, archaeologists have excavated the remains of mammoth bone dwellings dating to between 15 and 25,000 years ago. The most extensively studied sites, including Mezhirish and Mezin in Ukraine and Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, have revealed the foundations of multiple structures, each constructed from hundreds of mammoth bones, carefully arranged in patterns that demonstrate clear architectural planning. The Measure-Itch site alone yielded the remains of 4 separate mammoth bone structures, constructed using bones from at least 149 individual mammoths. 149 mammoths. The scale of that number is worth sitting with for a moment. Even spread across generations of occupation at the site, the quantity of mammoth material incorporated into these structures represents an extraordinary level of human-mammoth interaction and speaks to the degree to which these animals were the foundational resource of Ice Age culture in this region. Here is the lesser-known detail that adds another layer of complexity. The bones used in these structures were not all fresh hunting kills. Analysis of the bone assemblages at mammoth bone dwelling sites shows a mixture of weathering patterns, soil staining, and preservation states consistent with bones that had been collected from multiple sources over extended periods, including naturally deceased animals, old surface finds, and possibly material deliberately stored and cached for future use. The people who built these structures were not simply slaughtering mammoths on demand. They were, in some cases, curating bone collections over time, selecting specific elements for specific structural purposes with a degree of forward planning that implies sophisticated resource management. Scientists still debate the precise balance of hunting, scavenging, and long-term bone collection that produced the assemblages found at mammoth bone dwelling sites, with some researchers arguing that certain sites show clear evidence of systematic hunting as the primary procurement strategy, and others pointing to taphonomic evidence, suggesting more opportunistic and varied acquisition. The answer probably varies between sites and across time, reflecting the flexible, adaptive strategies of the people who built them. The structural ingenuity of mammoth bone architecture extended beyond simple wall construction. Some sites show evidence of elaborate interior organization, designated areas for different activities, storage pits dug into the permafrost beneath the floor to preserve food at consistently low temperatures, and hearths positioned to maximize heat distribution through the interior space. The permafrost storage pits are particularly striking. The people using these sites had understood, through practical experience, that the frozen ground itself was a reliable refrigeration system, and they were deliberately exploiting it to extend the preservation of food across seasons. This is not improvised survival behavior. This is systematic resource management. The artistic dimension of mammoth bone culture is equally remarkable. Mammoth ivory was the preferred medium for Paleolithic carving across a wide geographic range and a long time span. The famous Venus figurines, small stylized representations of the human female form found across Ice Age Europe, were frequently carved from mammoth ivory. Portable art objects, including animal figurines, geometric engravings, and decorative beads, were produced in mammoth ivory by craftspeople whose technical skill is evident even to modern eyes. The oldest known figurative art in the world, the Lion Man of Hohenstein-Stadel, a remarkable carved figure combining human and lion features, was carved from mammoth ivory approximately 40,000 years ago. The fire beside the dwelling crackles softly in the cold air, and from inside comes the low sound of voices, not words you can understand, but the unmistakable cadence of human conversation at the end of a long day. The smell of rendered fat and wood smoke drifts toward you, warm and specific and oddly familiar across the distance of 20,000 years. Someone inside is probably telling a story. Humans always tell stories at the end of the day, in every culture, in every era, and in a dwelling built from mammoth bones, beside a fire kept burning with mammoth fat. The stories told here almost certainly included mammoths. They were impossible to leave out. The voices inside the bone dwelling have faded behind you now, swallowed by the soft, consistent silence of the steppe at night. You have moved back out into the open, following the herd again as it continues its slow, purposeful journey across the frozen landscape. And it is the purposefulness that catches your attention most, because the mammoth ahead is not wandering. It is not drifting in a random direction, dictated by wherever the wind happens to be weakest or the snow happens to be thinnest. It is going somewhere specific. The whole herd is. There is a direction, a destination, encoded in the movements of these animals in a way that suggests not instinct alone, but something closer to memory. Mammoth migration is one of the genuinely fascinating and genuinely unresolved puzzles of Pleistocene research. The question of where mammoths went, when they went there, and how they navigated across a landscape that changed dramatically between seasons and between years, is the kind of question that produces long, careful papers with inconclusive endings, and researchers who have spent entire careers building partial answers. What the evidence does clearly support is that mammoths moved. They moved a lot, and they moved far. Isotopic analysis, a technique that examines the chemical signatures preserved in mammoth tusks, which grow in layers like tree rings, and record the animal's diet and location over its lifetime, has revealed that individual mammoths regularly traveled hundreds of kilometers over the course of a year. Some specimens show isotopic signatures consistent with seasonal movements between lowland wintering areas and highland summer grazing grounds. Others suggest more complex, less obviously seasonal patterns that researchers are still working to interpret. The tusk isotope record is one of the more remarkable scientific tools available to mammoth researchers, and it deserves a moment of appreciation. Because a mammoth tusk grows continuously throughout the animal's life, laying down new material at the base while the tip wears away, it preserves a chemical diary of everything the animal ate and everywhere it went across years or even decades. By sampling tusk material at fine intervals and analyzing the isotopic composition of each sample, researchers can essentially read the mammoth's travel history in its own ivory. It is the closest thing to a GPS record that a 20,000-year-old animal is ever going to produce. Here is the lesser-known detail that makes the migration picture considerably more interesting. Some isotopic studies of mammoth tusks have revealed movement patterns that do not correspond to simple seasonal back-and-forth migration, but instead suggest long, directional journeys across hundreds of kilometers that appear to have been one way, animals moving consistently in a single direction over extended periods, not returning along the same route. This is consistent with a pattern seen in some modern elephant populations under environmental stress, where herds undertake large-scale directional movements in response to changing resource availability rather than following fixed annual circuits. Scientists still debate whether mammoth migration was primarily driven by predictable seasonal patterns or by more dynamic, environmentally responsive movements that varied year to year depending on local conditions. The isotopic evidence increasingly suggests the latter, or at least a combination of both. But assembling a complete picture of mammoth movement patterns across their entire geographic range remains a work in progress with significant gaps. The navigational question is perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the whole puzzle. How did mammoths find their way across a landscape without landmarks in the modern sense, across distances that exceeded what any individual animal could have traveled in a single season to destinations that included specific river crossings, mountain passes, and seasonal grazing grounds that the herd's matriarch may have last visited years earlier. The answer almost certainly lies in the combination of olfactory navigation, using scent to track the chemical signatures of vegetation, water, and other mammoth groups across enormous distances, and the accumulated spatial memory of experienced matriarchs. Modern elephant research has demonstrated that older female elephants carry detailed mental maps of their home ranges, remembering the locations of water sources, seasonal grazing areas, and travel routes across landscapes extending hundreds of kilometers. Given the close evolutionary relationship between elephants and mammoths, and the similar ecological pressures that would have made navigational memory equally valuable, it is reasonable to infer that mammoth matriarchs carried comparable spatial knowledge. This is why the death of an experienced matriarch was not simply the loss of one animal. It was potentially the loss of decades of accumulated navigational knowledge that could not be fully transferred to younger animals before it disappeared. Modern elephant researchers have documented cases where herds whose matriarchs died young subsequently made poor decisions about travel routes and resource locations that older, more experienced leaders would likely have avoided. In a landscape as demanding as the Mammoth Steppe, where a wrong turn in winter could mean the difference between a productive, foraging area and a blank, exhausted landscape, that kind of knowledge loss had real consequences. The herd has reached a slight ridge now, and the senior female pauses at the top of it, her trunk raised, reading the air that flows up from the valley below. Whatever she finds there satisfies her, because after a long moment of stillness, she begins to descend, the others falling into line behind her, with the easy compliance of absolute trust. She has been here before. She knows what is in that valley. She is carrying the route in her memory, the way the steppe carries the cold, completely and without effort. The herd follows her down into the dark. The valley the herd descended into is quieter than the open steppe above, sheltered from the wind by gentle slopes on either side. The grass here is slightly more accessible, the snow thinner, where the valley floor catches more sunlight during the brief winter days. It is a good place, a reliable place, presumably, given that the matriarch led her family here without hesitation. But there is something you notice. If you look carefully at the edges of the valley, something subtle enough that you might miss it in the darkness. The shrubs. There are more of them than there should be, pushing in from the valley walls in a slow, patient advance that has been going on for longer than any living mammoth can remember. The grassland that defines this place, that has always defined this place, is very gradually becoming something else. This is how the end of the mammoth's world began. Not with a dramatic event, not with a catastrophe visible from a distance, but with shrubs. The climate of the late Pleistocene did not change overnight. It changed the way very large things tend to change, slowly, unevenly, with periods of apparent stability, interrupted by sudden lurches in a new direction, and with consequences that cascaded through ecosystems in ways that were impossible to predict from inside the process. Beginning roughly 14 to 15,000 years ago, as the last glacial maximum began to release its grip on the northern hemisphere, average temperatures started rising, glaciers began retreating, sea levels began climbing as locked water returned to the oceans, and the Mammoth Steppe, that vast, cold, dry grassland that had dominated the northern latitudes for hundreds of thousands of years, began to contract. The mechanism of steppe collapse was not simply that it got warmer, it is more precise than that. The Mammoth Steppe depended on a specific combination of conditions: cold temperatures that kept decomposition slow and preserved soil nutrients in frozen organic layers, low precipitation that prevented waterlogging of the soil, and strong winds that maintained the dry, open character of the landscape. As temperatures rose, each of these conditions began to shift. Permafrost thawed in surface layers, releasing water into the soil and creating the boggy, waterlogged terrain that is now characteristic of much of Siberia. Increased precipitation arrived with warmer air masses, trees and shrubs, which had been suppressed by cold and aridity, began expanding into grassland margins. The open steppe began breaking into fragments. The fragments began shrinking, and the specialized cold, dry grassland ecosystem that had sustained mammoth populations for hundreds of thousands of years began to disappear beneath a landscape the mammoths had not evolved to inhabit. Here is the lesser-known detail that reframes the climate story considerably. The vegetation shift was not simply a passive response to warming temperatures. It was accelerated by the loss of the animals that had maintained the grassland. As mammoth populations declined, from whatever combination of climate pressure, habitat loss, and human hunting was responsible, their grazing pressure on the landscape decreased. Less grazing meant less suppression of shrub and tree growth. Less trampling meant less soil disturbance, and less opportunity for grass seedlings to establish in disturbed ground. The grassland that mammoths had helped maintain began converting to shrubland, and eventually to the boggy, moss-dominated tundra and sparse boreal forest that characterizes much of the same geographic range today. This is the ecological feedback loop at the heart of the mammoth's decline. The climate change reduced mammoth numbers. Reduced mammoth numbers accelerated the vegetation change. The vegetation change further reduced the habitat available to mammoths, which further reduced mammoth numbers. The mammoth and its ecosystem were so deeply intertwined that the decline of one inevitably accelerated the decline of the other in a process that, once started, had a terrible momentum of its own. Scientists still debate the relative contributions of climate change and human hunting to the final extinction of woolly mammoths, and this debate is one of the most active and sometimes heated in all of Pleistocene science. The overkill hypothesis, most associated with the researcher Paul Martin, argues that human hunting was the primary driver of megafaunal extinction across multiple continents. The climate hypothesis argues that environmental change was the dominant factor, and a growing number of researchers advocate for a combined model in which neither factor alone was sufficient, but their interaction, climate-stressed populations, made newly vulnerable to human hunting pressure they might otherwise have absorbed, produced extinctions that neither factor would have caused independently. The honest position, supported by an increasingly detailed fossil and genetic record, is that the combined model is probably closest to the truth, but that the proportional contribution of each factor varied by location, time period, and species. In some places and times, human hunting appears to have been decisive. In others, climate and habitat change seem to have done most of the work before humans arrived in significant numbers. The shrubs at the valley's edge continue their patient advance in the darkness. Indifferent to the debate, the mammoth herd has settled for the night in the shelter of the valley floor, the animals standing in loose proximity, their breathing slow and visible in the cold air. The senior female stands slightly apart, as she always does, facing the valley entrance with the quiet alertness of long habit. She does not know that the world she navigates so expertly is changing beneath her feet. She knows only what her senses tell her, and tonight They tell her that the valley is safe, the herd is together, and the cold is manageable. For now, that is enough. There is a particular kind of scientific discovery that produces, upon first encounter, a sensation somewhere between delight and mild existential disorientation. The kind of discovery that requires you to quietly reorganize something you thought you understood, to move a piece of the picture that seemed fixed into a new position, and then stand back and look at the whole thing again with fresh eyes. The story of the last woolly mammoths is exactly that kind of discovery, and it remains one of the more quietly astonishing facts in all of Pleistocene science. The standard narrative of mammoth extinction goes roughly like this. By around 10,000 years ago, as the Pleistocene gave way to the Holocene, and the world settled into the warmer, wetter conditions of the current epoch, woolly mammoths had disappeared from their continental range. The vast herds that had moved across Eurasia and North America for hundreds of thousands of years were gone. The mammoth steppe was gone. The great megafaunal community of the Ice Age was gone. The mammoths were extinct. Full stop. Except they were not. Not quite. Not yet. While the continental mammoth populations were indeed collapsing and disappearing throughout the early Holocene, something remarkable was happening on a small island in the Arctic Ocean that almost nobody knew about for a very long time. On Wrangel Island, a remote landmass sitting off the northeastern coast of Siberia in the Arctic Ocean, a population of woolly mammoths survived in complete isolation for an extraordinary additional period. Not for a few centuries, not for 1,000 years, for approximately 6,000 years after their continental relatives had vanished. The last woolly mammoths on Wrangel Island died approximately 4,000 years ago. To put that in perspective, 4,000 years ago, the Egyptian Old Kingdom had already risen and fallen. The pyramids of Giza had been standing for 500 years. Woolly mammoths were still alive. This discovery, which emerged from radiocarbon dating of Wrangel Island mammoth, remains beginning in the 1990s, genuinely reorganized the scientific understanding of mammoth extinction. It demonstrated that mammoths were not inherently doomed by the end of the Pleistocene, that given the right conditions, specifically isolation from the combined pressures of habitat loss and human hunting, they could persist into the Holocene world. Wrangel Island, separated from the mainland by rising sea levels as glaciers melted, became an accidental refuge, a place where mammoths could continue doing what mammoths had always done, on an island small enough that humans had not yet reached it in significant numbers. Here is the lesser-known detail that adds a note of both wonder and sadness to the Wrangel Island story. The isolated mammoth population on Wrangel Island was not identical to its continental ancestors. Over the thousands of years of isolation, the island mammoths underwent evolutionary changes consistent with the particular pressures of island life. They became smaller, a phenomenon called island dwarfism that occurs in many large mammals when isolated on islands with limited resources. Wrangel Island mammoths were noticeably smaller than their continental counterparts, reflecting generations of natural selection, favoring individuals who could survive on the island's more limited food supply. Genetic analysis of Wrangel Island. Mammoth DNA has also revealed evidence of what geneticists call genomic meltdown, the accumulation of potentially harmful genetic mutations in a small, isolated population with reduced genetic diversity. When a population becomes very small, the random process of genetic drift begins to fix mutations that would normally be weeded out by natural selection in larger populations, because there simply are not enough individuals for selection to work efficiently. Wrangel Island mammoth genomes show signatures of this process, including mutations affecting genes associated with neurological development, male fertility, and the sense of smell. Scientists still debate the degree to which genomic meltdown contributed to the eventual extinction of the Wrangel Island population, with some researchers arguing the genetic evidence suggests the population was already in serious difficulty before humans arrived on the island, and others arguing that human arrival was the decisive final factor, regardless of the population's genetic condition. Both pressures were probably real, and their interaction was probably what ended the last mammoths. There is something deeply moving about the Wrangel Island story. When you sit with it quietly, these were not the magnificent, vast-ranging animals that dominated the continental steppe at the height of the last glacial maximum. They were the remnant, the reduced, the genetically burdened survivors of a world that had already ended everywhere else. They lived on their small Arctic island, smaller than their ancestors, carrying accumulated genetic damage in their cells, while the rest of the Holocene world went about the business of becoming what it is today. And then they were gone too. The valley around you is very quiet now. The herd sleeps. The shrubs at the edges hold their position in the darkness, patient and unhurried. Somewhere far to the north, across distances of both space and time that are difficult to hold in the mind simultaneously, a small island sits in an Arctic ocean, and 4,000 years from this moment, it will be empty of the last mammoths. But that is later. Tonight the herd is still here, still breathing, still warm. That counts for something. The valley is beginning to lighten almost imperceptibly at its eastern edge. That particular quality of darkness that precedes dawn on a clear winter night, shifting by degrees towards something slightly less absolute. The herd is stirring. The senior female has already moved to the edge of the group, her trunk sweeping slowly through the cold morning air in that familiar gesture of assessment. The world, she has apparently concluded, is acceptable. The day can begin. And somewhere in the gap between her ancient morning ritual and your modern understanding of what she represents to contemporary science, there is a connection that is worth pausing on before tonight's journey draws toward its close. Because woolly mammoths did not simply end. They became something else. They became one of the most scientifically productive, extinct species in the history of paleontology, generating research, debate, ethical controversy, and genuine wonder in quantities that continue to grow, rather than diminish more than 4,000 years after the last one died. The foundation of modern mammoth science is ancient DNA, and the story of how it became available is itself remarkable. Permafrost, that frozen ground that preserved the mammoth steppe's organic material for tens of thousands of years, is one of the finest natural preservatives for biological tissue that exists on Earth. Mammoth specimens recovered from Siberian permafrost have included not just bones and teeth, but intact soft tissue, preserved hair, frozen stomach contents, and in some extraordinary cases, liquid blood recovered from specimens so well preserved that their muscle tissue retained its characteristic reddish color. The quality of preservation in some permafrost mammoth specimens approaches that of deep frozen laboratory samples, and the genetic material recoverable from such specimens has revolutionized what scientists can learn about mammoth biology. The mammoth genome has now been sequenced multiple times, from multiple specimens, with a level of completeness and resolution that would have seemed impossible 30 years ago. This genomic data has allowed researchers to identify the specific genetic variants responsible for mammoth cold adaptations, including that remarkable hemoglobin modification discussed earlier in tonight's journey, and to trace the evolutionary relationships between mammoth populations across time and geography with extraordinary precision. It has also made possible something that was science fiction a generation ago and is now active, funded, controversial, and moving faster than most people realize: de-extinction. The deliberate resurrection of an extinct species using ancient DNA and modern biotechnology. The most prominent de-extinction effort focused on mammoths is being pursued by a company called Colossal Biosciences, which has attracted significant funding and considerable scientific talent to the project of creating a cold-adapted elephant, not a perfect genetic copy of a woolly mammoth, which is probably not achievable, but an Asian elephant with mammoth-specific genetic variants introduced using CRISPR gene editing technology. The Asian elephant is the mammoth's closest living relative, sharing roughly 99.6% of its genome, which makes it the most practical starting point for any resurrection attempt. Here is the lesser-known detail that changes how most people think about the de-extinction project. The stated goal of the Colossal project is not simply to produce a novelty animal or to satisfy scientific curiosity, though it would certainly achieve both. The stated ecological goal is to eventually reintroduce cold-adapted elephant-mammoth hybrids to Siberian permafrost landscapes, where their grazing behavior, trampling snow to expose frozen ground to cold air, clearing shrubs to maintain grassland, fertilizing soil with dung, could theoretically slow the thawing of permafrost that is currently releasing ancient stored carbon into the atmosphere at an accelerating rate. This is the same ecological engineering function that mammoths performed naturally for hundreds of thousands of years, now being proposed as a deliberate conservation intervention. Whether it would work at meaningful scale is genuinely uncertain. Whether it is ethically appropriate to create animals carrying the genetic legacy of an extinct species for ecological management purposes is actively debated. Whether the technology will succeed in producing viable animals with the desired suite of traits is an open scientific question. Scientists still debate virtually every aspect of mammoth de-extinction, from the technical feasibility of producing cold-adapted animals with sufficient mammoth traits to function effectively in Arctic ecosystems, to the ecological risks of introducing a novel, large herbivore to landscapes that have not contained one for thousands of years, to the deeper philosophical question of what obligations, if any, humans have toward species whose extinction they may have contributed to. The debate is genuine, the stakes are real, and the science is moving fast enough that the answers are arriving before the ethical frameworks for handling them are fully established, which is a situation humanity has been in before and has not always navigated gracefully. But beyond de-extinction, mammoths continue to matter to science in quieter ways. Every new permafrost specimen yields additional data about population genetics, dietary ecology, developmental biology, and the mechanisms of cold adaptation. Every isotopic study of a newly recovered tusk adds detail to the picture of mammoth movement and behavior. Every analysis of a mammoth bone site refines the understanding of human-mammoth interaction and the dynamics of late Pleistocene ecosystems. The mammoth is gone, but it has not stopped teaching. The herd is fully awake now, moving out of the valley and back onto the open steppe, with the unhurried confidence of animals that own this landscape completely. The senior female leads, as always. The others follow, their breath rising in small clouds that catch the first pale light and dissolve almost immediately into the cold, clear air. 4,000 years from now, somewhere on a small Arctic island, the last of their kind will take its final steps. But that is then. This is now. And right now, they are magnificent. The steppe has grown very still in this final hour before full daylight. The herd has moved further out across the plain, their shapes growing smaller and softer against the pale horizon until they are somewhere between visible and imagined. Dark suggestions of movement in a landscape that seems to breathe slowly and without urgency. The cold is the same cold it has been all night, but it feels different now, gentler somehow, as if the world itself has settled into a quieter register, the way long stories tend to settle in their final pages, the pace easing, the details softening, the larger shape of everything becoming clear only now that the journey is nearly complete. You have covered a great deal of ground tonight. You have watched a mammoth herd navigate a frozen valley by the accumulated wisdom of a matriarch who has made this journey more times than memory precisely tracks. You have stood beside a dwelling built from the bones of animals that were simultaneously hunted and revered, feared and depended upon. You have followed a species across hundreds of thousands of years of cold weather adaptation through the extraordinary engineering of fur and blood chemistry and grinding teeth, through the social complexities of matriarchal family groups and competing males, through the vast grassland empire they helped build and maintain, and eventually, gradually, lost. The story of the woolly mammoth is, at its heart, a story about belonging, about what it means to be so precisely suited to a particular world that you and that world become inseparable, each sustaining the other in ways neither could fully manage alone. The mammoth steppe needed the mammoth to remain the mammoth steppe. The mammoth needed the mammoth steppe to remain the mammoth. When that relationship began to unravel, from the outside pressure of a changing climate, from the additional pressure of a clever and hungry primate arriving with sharp tools and long memories, neither could save the other. The empire did not fall in a day. It dissolved, slowly, over thousands of years, leaving behind frozen echoes in permafrost and ivory and bone. And the mammoths themselves left quietly, as most things do, not in a dramatic final stand on some frozen plain, but in the gradual reduction of a population on a small Arctic island, animals growing smaller with each generation, carrying in their cells the accumulated weight of isolation and genetic drift, until one day there were none. The world did not mark the moment. The Arctic Ocean moved as it always had. The permafrost held its ancient carbon. The shrubs continued their patient advance across what had once been grassland, and the ice, which had been the mammoth's kingdom and its cradle and its defining condition, continued its own slow retreat into the north, carrying with it the last physical memory of a world that no longer exists. There is no sadness required here, though it is easy to feel something quiet and close to it. The mammoth lived fully, abundantly, for hundreds of thousands of years across a range that spanned most of the northern hemisphere. It shaped ecosystems. It sustained cultures. It carved its presence into the art and mythology and daily lives of every human population that shared its world. And now it persists in frozen ground, in carved ivory figurines, in museum cases, in the sequenced letters of an ancient genome, in the ongoing debates of researchers who have devoted their careers to understanding a creature they will never see alive. That is a kind of permanence, different from breathing, but not without its own quiet dignity. The herd on the horizon has almost dissolved into the pale morning light now. The last shape you can make out is the senior female, slightly separate from the others as always. Her silhouette holding its definition a moment longer than the rest, before she too becomes part of the light and the distance and the cold. She is going somewhere she has been before, following a route she carries in her memory, the way the steppe carries the cold, completely and without effort. And now, as the mammoth's world fades gently into the pale light of a prehistoric dawn, it is time to let your own world grow quiet around you. You have traveled a long way tonight, across frozen plains and through sheltered valleys, beside ancient fires and beneath enormous skies. The cold that surrounded every moment of this journey is easing now, replaced by the warmth of wherever you happen to be lying down. Your bed, your couch, that particular comfortable position you found sometime in the last hour and have been slowly sinking deeper into. Let your breathing slow a little more with each exhale. There is nothing to keep track of now. The mammoths have gone to wherever the light takes them, and the steppe is settling into its long, quiet morning. The wind that moved through the whole of tonight's journey has softened to almost nothing, just a faint suggestion of movement across frozen grass, the sound of a world at rest. Somewhere deep beneath the permafrost of Siberia, ancient ivory holds the chemical record of a journey taken 20,000 years ago. A tusk, slowly giving up its secrets to the patient work of science, carrying within its layers the diary of a life lived fully in a world of cold and grass and open sky. Let that image settle gently over you, like snow settling over the steppe, quietly, evenly, without urgency, covering everything in a soft and undisturbed white. The mammoths ruled their frozen world completely and gracefully and for a very long time. And tonight, for a little while you were there to see it.